Even for parents with children. I mean, every parent knows the glazed look that comes over their child's eye when they start to tell them about something in their behaviour that's unacceptable. So we have to keep the person's ears open. And I've never known a person not to keep their ears open for a compliment. So that, for example, if you've got an employee who's coming in late in the morning, you might start off by saying, well, look, John, I want to tell you that we're very, very happy with the quality of work you're doing here. You're doing really good work for us. But we also need you to be here in time. Now, John is much more likely to hear the second part of that remark if it's prefixed by something, that approves him, that doesn't diminish his sense of self-esteem. That's a very good strategy. In terms of other people criticising us, we have many choices that we can use. One, of course, if the criticism is valid, then we should take it on board. I mean, sometimes the criticism is valid. But other times people just have a nagging criticism they're making of us. And these can easily escalate into a row. So one good technique is called fogging. And that is, rather than directly rejecting the criticism and going defensive, we look to see, is there some element of the criticism that we can agree with, or some point? And if there's not some aspect of it that we can agree with, we can still fog by saying something like, well, you have your point. You're certainly entitled to your viewpoint on it. So we don't directly challenge it. We can say to the person, well, you may be right. We just have to wait and see. So rather than getting bogged down in useless defensive measures, we simply allow the person the right to have their viewpoint. In fact, so often in life, when we think we have the truth, what's actually happening is we have a clash of values. We have a clash of priorities. We're not talking about the truth, we're talking about relative positions vis-a-vis some objective. And so it's only right to acknowledge that the other person has a point of view, and they have a right to that point of view. Again, what can be very helpful in terms of other people trying to get us to do things that we don't want to do, rather than just getting angry about it. If we recognize that we have a right to our feelings, and suppose somebody wants to borrow our motor car, for example, a friend, and we don't want to lend it. If we just simply come out and report upon our feelings, but without attacking them. So rather than saying, oh, no, I'm not going to lend you my car because I think, you're a bad driver or you might crash it, which is bound to lead to an argument, we can say to him, look, I'm sure you're a very good driver, and I absolutely accept that you would look after my car well. But I feel really uncomfortable when I lend somebody my car. For that reason, I don't. So we simply report upon our feelings rather than attacking the other person. It can be very, very good. A third thing that is really useful in the context of criticism is to recognize that we all make mistakes. So just because somebody points out an error we have made, we don't have to go into a defensive position. We can still be an effective and a good human being even though we make mistakes. And here we need to give ourselves the right to be human, the right to, on occasions, make mistakes without having to go on a massive guilt trip. See, we've been trained since childhood, as soon as somebody points out a mistake, to start feeling guilty. But you don't have to feel guilty just because you made a mistake. It's natural to make mistakes. Most of the time you're probably getting it right. So if somebody says you got something wrong, you say, yeah, that was really stupid of me, wasn't it? Gosh, I can't imagine what I was thinking about. But you don't go on a guilt trip about it. And then you'll find, that makes these situations so much more easy to handle.
There are times and situations with all of us, but perhaps even more particularly people in the public eye, when they're faced with very angry people and a situation that can turn violent. What can be done in those sort of emergency situations?
Well, the first thing is to recognize that this person is in a trance state. That means that they can only see their own version of reality. And they don't see you as a human being. They just see you as an object standing in the way of what they need to happen. We have to help this person to recognize, A, that we're a human being, and B, that we're on their side. And there's some very specific skills that are appropriate here. Firstly, we need to recognize our non-verbal behavior is an important determinant of what happens. Our brain devotes something like 90% of its analysis to the non-verbal gestures in communicating with people. So we now know that when people are getting along well, their body positions tend to match. The non-verbal behavior tends to match up. Say you're a nurse sitting down at a desk and you're confronted by Mrs. Jones, who's very angry because her operation has been cancelled 3 times in a row. We need to, first of all, start doing some matching here. What we can do, she's talking loudly to us. Our instinct initially might be to talk in a very soft voice. That would be inappropriate. It would be better to actually raise the level of our voice, perhaps midway between where we'd normally speak in a soft voice and to where Mrs. Jones' voice level is. That shows Mrs. Jones straight away that you're interested, that you're reacting to what she's saying. But we also actively listen with what we say. So we might say something like, well, Mrs. Jones, I can really understand why you would be so worked up. I mean, this is the third time your operation has been cancelled. If that happened to me, I'd be furious. Of course you're upset. Now, that's straight away you're going into her model of reality, and you're both seeing the world from the same viewpoint. That means that you are, as it were, shoulder to shoulder with Mrs. Jones, helping her to resolve her problems, rather than being the person who's standing in the way of her problems being solved. So we need to go into the other person's model of reality. And we can do that firstly by matching the non-aggressive portions of their non-verbal behaviour. So I would recommend this nurse, for example, to slowly stand up, because any sudden movement can be interpreted as an aggressive movement. But if she slowly stood up, having first of all made that statement to Mrs. Jones, then she could gently lead Mrs. Jones to a chair, because once you've matched and you've actively listened, then you can talk about changing the aggressor's behaviour. Then she could put her hand behind her shoulder and say something like, look, Mrs. Jones, I want to do something to sort this out for you. So why not just come over here and sit down, and I'm going to see what I can do to help you today. Then she can lead Mrs. Jones to a chair and put her sitting down. But the key step is, first of all, match, both in non-verbal behaviour, match the person's model of reality through active listening. And then you lead them into a non-aggressive reaction. Now, of course, there are other things that the person needs to be aware of as well. Some situations can't be controlled. Even though we do all of this, the person may still start to escalate out of control. It may be that they even have sort of physical triggers that we talked about earlier on. But if we perceive that a situation is likely to step out of control...
And it can happen very quickly.
And it can happen quickly. We need, first of all, to have been preparing ourselves for this contingency. We should, if possible, for example, if there's a large object in the room, manoeuvre ourselves so there's a desk between us and the other person. It makes it harder for them to reach over and hit us. If we're on, say, the ground floor and there's a window open, if you think, physical aggression is possible here, you shouldn't hesitate. You should just get out the window if that's the most easy way out of it. Or if you're talking to the person, you could gradually manipulate and move yourself over towards a door and then get out. But our first line of defence when we're confronted with physical aggression should be to try and extricate ourselves from it. This is the advice given by the police, by the army, and by all experts on dealing with aggression. That having used the types of psychological techniques we talked about, if the danger is still present, then we should, as a first resolve, extricate ourselves from the situation. Another technique, Ivan, that is very useful in dealing with anger is to be able to consider the issue from the other person's viewpoint. Now, essentially, this is what actually has to happen if we are going to make any progress. We have to be, as it were, able to put ourselves into the other person's shoes and experience their reality. Now, we can do this either through active listening, through getting them to explain to us exactly what their position is. But an alternative way of doing it is through the power of the imagination. If we get ourselves all nicely calmed down and relaxed, we can then replay the argument on a screen so that we're some distance from it and just observe what happened. Then we could imagine ourselves floating into the screen and actually being the other person and just observe ourselves, observe our own behaviour, listen to what the other person listened to as we were talking, and imagine the world from the other person's viewpoint. That then opens up our own trance so that we can start to see the bigger picture. Because that's, at the end of the day, that's what's essential. It's only when people can understand each other's perspectives that an issue can be resolved. So we can either do it, as it were, through language, but we can also use our imagination effectively as a possibility. So we've been talking there about the importance of going into the other person's trance state. Let me just give you an example of that in a clinical setting.